Hello everyone. Let's begin by talking about the schema theory. And this article I've chosen is from the English language teaching, and the article discusses schema into a great extent, but it also does a very good job of discussing the background literature of it. So I've highlighted some sections on here about the schema. It says right here, in traditional English teaching, new words and grammatical rules were regarded as the core of English learning. So this first paragraph right here discusses the idea that schema was kind of pushed to the side, and that when you talked about English language in the early days, you were looking at this concept that everyone should learn whole words and just learn reading by learning thousands of different words. Right here says, this next paragraph says, according to Goodman, 1971, reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game. He thinks that in the reading process, the reader reconstruct as best he can a message which can be encoded by a writer as a graphic display. In 1979, Crody elaborated on the basic psycholinguistic model by reading and suggested a model in which the reader's background knowledge interacts with conceptual abilities. So this is where we start getting the idea of schemas, which is this idea that when we read, we're actually using past information and past knowledge base to help us interpret words. I can give you an example. If you read the word mountain, you think, well, mountain. But when you read it for the first time, you think, mountain. So you really have no basic knowledge of mountain. But now when I say the word mountain and you actually can visualize mountain, you probably also visualize an actual mountain. And you think of that idea. So that's because you have a schema of what a mountain is. I was reading a book one time about Everest, and it talked about Sherpas. Well, I had a background knowledge of what a Sherpa is. So when I read the word Sherpa, I have a lot of schemas that pop up, and I understand. I've seen studies on Sherpas and how they're high mountain climbers. So that's the idea that when you're reading, these different background knowledge helps you process that. So it's like you know what the word is, but you also have connections to the word. It also says, where this highlighted part right here, making predictions and processing information. The role of background knowledge in language comprehension has been formalized as the schema theory. So just think of schema as you're reading, you have all these backup connections that you still remember and you still process, and it helps you understand words faster. This paragraph right here says, a text only provides directions for listeners or readers as how they should retrieve or construct meaning of their own, namely acquired knowledge. For the previously acquired knowledge, structures are called schema theory. Schema theory is the theory of how knowledge is acquired, processed, and retrieved. Schemas or schemata are seen as cognitive constructs by which we organize information in our long-term memory. So whenever you read a book, whenever you read any passages, as you're gaining this information, you start putting it in your head, and it goes in the back of your head or wherever it goes in your head, and it becomes long-term memory. So when you read, those items can keep popping up in your head and helps you interpret. And that's where that one thing that said that this is a processing and predicting information. So it becomes the schemata becomes known as the building blocks of cognition. Let's look at this next page. Every act of comprehension involves one's knowledge of the world. Not every act of listening, but every act of comprehension. If we make sense of the world at all, it is by interpreting our interactions with the world in the light of our theory. The theory is our shield against bewilderment. So as long as we have schematas and schemas in the back of our head that connect things, and we have understanding of basic needs in our lives and how things work, then we won't be bewildered and confused. You see this a lot in the news whenever someone says they saw something and they have no reference to that. I saw a UFO and that just has blown my mind and I'm shocked. Or when someone sees a magic trick and they have no comprehension of how that actually worked. That's how magicians work. When magicians show you an illusion and it kind of scares you and confuses you, then you kind of go, well, that's just magic. We put that in that category of that's magic. While someone who actually has an understanding of illusions would say, I think I can put my head around this. I think I can grasp this knowledge. There's got to be a trick to it. But people who have no understanding of magic or illusions would actually say that they're just bewildered. That's magic. He's got a gift. The schema theory thinks that comprehending a text is an interactive process between the reader's background knowledge and the text. So whenever you go into a book, it's about what you've read, and then You battle the book for the information. Obviously, the more knowledge of the world one has, the better comprehension he gets. He gents about the text. It says gents. It receives from the text. So the smarter you are, defined by having more schemas and understanding society and had read more books, then you could actually get more out of some books. Input is mapped against some existing schema. Then there's bottom-up and top-down processing, and you can read this on your own. Top-down processing takes place as the system makes general predictions based on higher-level general schema, which means background knowledge in reading comprehension. And bottom-up means you take it and you start building your schemas from there. From the schema theory, it is clear that meaning is not fully presented in a text passively, waiting to be decoded by the reader. So the meaning is in the text for you to connect it with the schemas that you have. So therefore, you could actually read text that is a complex text that has complex meanings, and if you do not have any schemas in there, then you couldn't comprehend that. And that's why we always get frustrated with English literature classes and classes which have like poetry. Whenever you read those and you say, hey, I don't really get the meaning from that, but your poetry teacher says, oh, well, this is what the meaning is. Well, the poetry teacher has all of these schematas in place. They've studied all this poetry and they understand that. And someone who doesn't study poetry goes, well, I don't really get the meaning. Teach the students to link their prior knowledge with the text. Now, how can we do this, and how can we make sure that schematas are in place? And of course, we're going to get into pre-assessments. And that's what this says right here. Pre-reading activities, webbing, brainstorming, strip sentences, songs, role-playing. So you really want to assess with the students and see if you can get some of those schematas connected and see if there's actually an assessment system in place for you to see what they know. The usefulness of pre-reading activities can be concluded in Brown's own words. Before you read, spend some time introducing the topic. So this allows you to connect that. We're going to read about this. We're going to read about geography. Let's talk about some aspects of geography so we can connect this in our head. It's kind of like stretching before you run. You should also try to stimulate some of your schematas and try to get that ready for the reading. Ability to relate the textual material to one's own knowledge. They will fail to read and understand even the simplified text of a major field. It says here, if the students have enough relevant knowledge, then they're not going to be able to connect with the major field. Language is the carrier of culture. And I thought that was a very important aspect of this article. Continues on, it says, as it says, teachers should select or develop appropriate materials for students to read in order to help them minimize cultural misunderstanding. That if they're not grabbing or grasping cultural identity, then they can actually create stereotypes, which are bad. Gradually built up, which will eventually facilitate reader in reading in general. Before the repeated vocabulary of a particular topic or the particular style of a writer is presented to him continuously, when the schemata is repeated, then learning is gained even more. So you just want to continue to reinforce those schematas. The article continues on about analyzing the structure of text as well as other elements to get you some teaching tips. But I just thought this was a really, really good article about schematas. And just reading this, you kind of get the idea of what a schema is and how it builds on prior knowledge and how you can build it up. But more importantly, that writing and text, and when you read something, if you don't have a background knowledge of those words, if you don't have a background knowledge of those phrases, like if I say mountain, okay, mountain range, snow cap, when you start getting those complex phrases together, especially in a middle school or a higher school level, then if you don't have a schemata in place for that, then learning is going to be hampered, or even if it's not going to occur at all. I'm going to show you a video next about this person did a presentation on schemata. It's going to go a little bit higher level on this one, more in depth, but hopefully with this article combined with that video will help you have a better understanding.
Hey there, so today's learning outcome for the cognitive level of analysis is to evaluate schema theory with reference to research studies. So here's a brief overview of my video. So we're going to talk about what schema theory is. Then we're going to talk about 2 studies that support this theory, and then we're going to evaluate this theory. So what is a schema? Well, schema is a mental representation of knowledge. So for example, if we hear the word classroom, what do you guys think about? Well, there may be various arrangements of classrooms, such as this, where students are individually aligned into rows and columns, and then another schema, which may be students in groups. Another schema may be a homeschooler, where there's a tutor and a student. And then lastly, there may be a circular arrangement where there are a lot of class discussions. So this may be pertain to you. I don't know. For me, I think my classroom schema might be the second one or the first one. And when we typically hear the word classroom, I think about a whiteboard, a marker, students, desks, chairs, and an apple. I think it's portrayed in the media a lot, like an apple on the teacher's desk. But people have different schemas. Like I have different schemas than many other people because people have different backgrounds. So, schemas can describe how specific knowledge is organized and stored in memory so that it can be accessed and used when it is needed. So, schema theory states that what we already know will influence the outcome of information processing. So, schema theory involves 3 steps. The first step is encoding. Well, encoding is transforming sensory information into a meaningful memory. So, for example, we smell bread and we realize that this is what bread smells like, or we see Kim Kardashian either online or in real life and we're like, oh, this is what Kim Kardashian looks like. Then we have the next step, which is storage. Storage is basically maintaining the experience in our memory, and it creates a biological trace of the encoded information. The last step is a retrieval. We recover the experience from our memory. Now, schema theory can either enhance or distort memory. So the example on the right is an example of a mnemonic and an example where schema theory can enhance memory. So we have the equation for density. Density is mass over volume, and if we see, it's kind of hard to memorize. So if we see the equation, you realize that it kind of looks like a heart, and if we remove the line, yeah, it does kind of look like a heart. So hearts are part of our schema. We see hearts all the time, so it's stored in our memory. Now, if we associate the shape of a heart to this equation, we can easily remember this equation. Density equals mass over volume, right? But then it can also distort memory. So for example, if we have a cultural stereotype or bias, then it can obviously affect what our memory. So for example, I'm going to talk about this later, but if we hear a story of Cinderella for the first time, Cinderella's godmother makes a carriage for her to ride to the ball, right? And then if a person from the 21st century hears this story for the first time, they are not used to, well, typically in Western culture, people don't ride carriages or chariots around, right? So they typically associate modes of transportation with like cars, buses, or taxis or whatever, but not really chariots, right? So they might replace the chariot with a conventional mode of transportation, which is buses or taxis. So this is how the schema theory can distort memory. Now we're going to look at the first study, which is on reconstructive memory. This is by Anderson and Pitchert, and it was conducted in 1978. So basically, the aim of this study was to investigate if schema processing influences both encoding and retrieval. So encoding is putting an experience into the memory, and retrieval is recovering the experience from the memory. So this was a laboratory experiment, which means that this wasn't in a person's natural everyday life. It was actually like people knew this was an experiment. So the procedure: participants were to hear a story on 2 boys who went to the home of one of them, so after school. And then they were told that half of the participants were told that you were to listen to the story on the perspective of a potential house buyer, so a house buyer schema. And then the other half was to listen to the story on the perspective of a burglar, so the burglar schema. These different schemas have different memory abilities, because if you're on the perspective of a house buyer, you pay attention to things like what the wallpaper design is like, or how many rooms there are, how many bathrooms there are, like things like that. But then burglars tend to listen to the information where the money is stored, when the mom is outside, those things. So house buyers and burglars have different aspects of the story to pay attention to. So then they performed a distracting task for 12 minutes because they wanted to unfreshen it, if that's a word, from their memory. And then the recall was tested. Then there was a 5-minute delay, and then there was another test. But then in this test, Before this test, half of the participants were given a different schema. So people who had the house buyer schema got the burglar schema, and people who got the burglar schema got the house buyer schema. And then the other half were asked to retain the original schema. So people who had the house buyer schema, they listened to the story again in a house buyer schema, and then the recall was tested again. Now, what do you think will happen to the recall? Well, the findings show that participants who switched schemas from burglar to homebuyer or homebuyer to burglar recalled 7% more on the second test. This may be because people who listen to two different schemas have a broader perspective on what the story is on. Now, there was a 10% increase in recall of the new schema, maybe because it was a new schema, the second schema, which was more fresh in their brains, and then there was a decline in recall of the previous schema, which is based on the same reason. The second schema is all obviously fresh in their brains. And then the participants who retained the first schema actually remembered fewer ideas in the second trial. This may be because there has been so much time that passed that they forgot, because there was the time for distraction and delay. And maybe because the participants were like tired, they're like, oh, when is this experiment going to be over? Because like when you first start something, you're very energetic and very engaged, but then after a few minutes, you're just like, oh, I give up. Like maybe the participants had that mindset. Okay, so the conclusion of this study was that schema processing must have some effect at retrieval and encoding. And an evaluation of this study. Well, this was very ethical because no one was harmed, no one was like emotionally or mentally hurt, and that this was very highly controlled because it was in a laboratory experiment. So the variables were also controlled. Now, there's benefits for having a laboratory experiment, but this also had a drawback, which is that it lacked ecological validity. So this is never going to happen in real life, like this is a legit experiment, okay? So the second study is a study called The War of the Ghost by Bartlett in 1932. So The War of the Ghost is actually a story that the researchers read to the participants. Okay, so the aim of, not read, but they had to read. Okay, so the aim of this study was to see if culture affects schema processing and memory. And this was also a laboratory experiment. It's very old, it's in the 1930s. But anyways, English participants were asked to read a Native American folktale. So English people and Native Americans obviously have different backgrounds, right? So the Native American folktales on like two boys, two Native American people on the perspective of Native Americans, like they went seal hunting and those things that English participants are not really used to. So they use two methods of recall. One is called serial reproduction, which is like the telephone game. The participant reproduces the story, the second person has to reproduce the first reproduction, and then so on until there are about 6 to 7 reproductions. And then the second method of recall is repeated reproduction, which means one participant reproduces the story after time intervals from as small as 15 minutes to even several years. And the study found that the story that were recalled became shorter. So that means they remembered less detail because, as time passes, you forget a lot of things. And then the story remained coherent. So the researcher Bartlett said that this was because people interpreted the story as a whole. So they understood the story and they formed links and cause and effect relationships. And also the story became more conventional. This means that the participants, after the reproductions, retained only those details that could be assimilated to the shared past experience and cultural background of the participants. So, you know how I mentioned that the story involved seal hunting? Well, English participants are not really used to the idea of seal hunting, so they switched those to fishing. Yeah, so they kind of remember it according to what they have been raised and they have been taught. So, the conclusion of the study was that people reconstruct the past by trying to fit it into existing schemas, and people try to find familiar patterns in experiences. And the evaluation of the study is that it used unsophisticated methodology, it had no variables, and it was just like, and it's also very, very old. Oh, and also, the top, it says study 1 reconstructive memory. This is actually the study on the War of the Ghost. I accidentally made a mistake, and this used a dynamic approach, which means that it used a culture And in this case, it used English participants, and this doesn't represent the population as a whole, right? The world as a whole. So that's kind of a thing that the researcher could improve on. But anyways, now let's evaluate the schema theory now that we looked at two studies. Well, the strength of the schema theory is that it has empirical evidence. You know, we looked at the study of the War of the Ghosts, and we also looked at the reconstructive study, and those also both support the schema theory. And there's also a lot of experiments that I haven't mentioned. And there's a lot of applications to the schema theory, and this helps us understand how memory works and how it can be distorted. However, there's also weaknesses. We cannot observe it. It's very vague. You know, like schema theory, how can we like accurately, numerically observe it? No, we can't, because this is something that happens in our brains, and no one can actually like look at our brains except for MRI scanning, which you can't really see how like schemas are formed. Yeah, so which leads on to the next bullet point, which says formation of schemas cannot be tested. This experiment was to see if schema theory was working. The formation part cannot be tested. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope it really helped for IB psychology or any of you guys like who's taking any psychology course. So this is actually my first video ever on this channel, and I'm going to film an intro video as well where I talk about who I am, and so stay tuned for that. I'm going to post videos on psychology as well as biology, chemistry, and other things that pertain to me and what I know. So thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so that completes schemata and schemes. So now let's look at what is known as Kolb's Learning Style Inventory, which is a separate part altogether. This is based on a professor named David Kolb, and it's called the Learning Style Inventory, but if you Google it, it'll be called Kolb Learning Style Inventory. This article does a really good job about breaking apart, and then we'll follow it with two videos. It says the studies have shown that students' performance is enhanced when learning styles are considered. Of course, we know what learning styles are, because as you see right here, it says Bloom's is a learning style and other items such as that. But the analysis of students' learning styles can enhance learning. So and then the article says it's going to examine learning style inventory. This first paragraph right here, I'm going to highlight it. It says that several classifications of learning style and related concepts have been developed through the years. These classifications include Solomon's, Myers-Briggs, and of course Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, which we'll look at a later time. But it says the most popular one is David Kolb's learning inventory. Kolb, it says, depending on how an individual perceives and internalizes information. Abstract learners are very analytical and logical. Concrete learners learn through examples, and reflective learners prefer to observe before making judgments, and they tend to be introverts. And active learners have experimentation tendencies, and they tend to be extroverts. This chart right here shows you concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, active experimentalization, and then it has accommodator, diverger, assimilator, and converger. So when you get in here, it shows you what the definitions of these are. For example, a diverger is a person with this learning style likes to generate a wide range of ideas and likes to gather information. They also have imaginative abilities which enhance creative and view situations from different points of view. Assimilators are able to understand and formulate information into a logical and concise form. Convergers, accommodators learn by understanding concepts and take an active form in learning. And accommodators are like convergers, have elements of active experimentation, and this takes an active form of learning. Accommodators rely heavily on people for information when solving problems and like to take risks, and thus will seek out new approaches to complete a project. You don't really need to learn all these different terms. It does help for if you're going to write a major essay. But the whole point of this is to see that there are different categories of people of the way they learn. It says indicated above there is a need to accommodate. Now this paragraph right here, I'm going to highlight the paragraph like this. this paragraph talks about that some teachers do not change their teaching style and some teachers do change their teaching style. And it says right here that teachers use the same teaching format regardless of their own learning style preference. But another research says that most instructors use the teaching style that works best for them to learn. So there's kind of a debate over which one it does. But one thing for sure is a teacher needs to accommodate by teaching different learning styles. We'll see how that can be done in a minute. Lindsay found that when learning style and teaching are congruent, there is an increase in student achievement and satisfaction. Found that older non-traditional students, 24 more years or older, tend to be convergers, while traditional students were assimilators. So if we get up here to convergers, convergers are accommodators learn by understanding concepts and take an active form in learning and are very attentive. And then when you see this right here, it says that younger people were assimilators. If we look at what an assimilator is, they are able to understand and formulate information into a logical and concise form. They are more focused on abstract ideas and concepts. Hence, they are very good at creating models and defining problems. They're also very good planners. So older people look more into the concept and maybe even the schematas. Simpson and Dew examined learning styles of distant students engaged in web-based courses and found that there was a significant relationship between learning style and students' enjoyment level, where convergers liked the courses the most and assimilators liked the courses the least. So some people are going to like online courses and some people are not going to like online courses. Now this sentence right here I thought was very intriguing. Educators may not be able to accommodate the learning style of each of their students. Which is true. You cannot accommodate 50 students or 30 students, but you can try. Now, this whole paper leads to this idea that there are different types of learners and different groups of people who, and also it changes as you get older. Teachers are also teaching differently, and some of them teach according to the way they've learned. So how can a teacher reach more people? And it says right here, it gives you these ideas which I've highlighted. You can do computer-based simulation exercises, scenario planning, role-playing, projects, case analysis, case in point. So these are six examples of different types of learning activities that you can do. Role-playing obviously is one. And by doing these six, you can actually reach out and hit a lot of those 4 different types of learners. So that was the whole purpose of the article. It talks about how better teachers can actually reach out to more people. So that's the idea of Kolb's learning experiences. I'm going to show you some video now, and they're more in-depth videos, and they're going to show you more about Kolb.
Some things come with labels that read, "One size fits most." Does one teaching style fit most too? One teaching style may provide a stellar fit for some learners, but find others hopelessly lost in a wealth of excess material. Another style may fit some participants to the proverbial T, but be stretched thin on the remainder of the class. David Kolb's learning styles inventory is based on his experiential learning model. According to this model, learning is based on concrete experience, observation of and reflection on that experience, formation of abstract concepts based upon the reflection, and testing the new concepts, followed by repetition of these 4 steps. Kolb's learning style inventory is one of several learning style models that have been developed. Other examples include Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers' Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, Richard Felder's and Linda Silverman's Felder-Silverman Learning Style Model, Neil Fleming's and Colleen Mills' VARK, A Guide to Learning Styles, and a number of other models designed to help instructors understand how they and their students learn. Kolb presented 4 learning styles in his learning styles inventory: accommodating, assimilating, converging, and diverging. Kolb's intent was to develop a holistic framework with which to approach teaching and learning. Kolb used axes as a basis for this framework. He positioned perceiving dimensions, concrete experience or feeling, and abstract conceptualization or thinking, on a vertical axis. Kolb placed processing dimensions, active experimentation or doing, and reflective observation or watching on a horizontal axis. Each of the learning types falls into one of the quadrants, demonstrating a blend of a perceiving and a processing dimension. Kolb perceived his learning styles as indicators of dominant learning tendencies, not a strict method to use in defining an individual's learning style. Ultimately, there is a subtle and complex relationship between learning and individual abilities and problem-solving skills. Kolb also recognized that most people are not exclusively one kind of learner. The accommodating learner occupies the upper left quadrant of Kolb's framework, between the concrete and active axes, indicating a preference for combining feeling or intuition with doing. Accommodators prefer to participate in controlled situations and are doers, people who can carry out plans and get involved with new projects. According to Kolb's learning skills profile, accommodators are associated with action, initiative, leadership, and relationship skills. The converging learner is in the lower left quadrant of Kolb's framework, between the abstract and active axes, indicating a preference for combining thinking with doing. Converging learners excel at technical tasks. Their greatest strengths are problem-solving, decision-making, and the practical application of ideas. Kolb's learning skills profile attributes converging learners with action, goal-setting, technology, and quantitative skills. The assimilating learner is in the lower right quadrant of Kolb's framework, between the reflective and abstract axes. Assimilators prefer thinking and watching. They like to solve problems by inductive reasoning. Assimilating learners tend toward theoretical professions and are less concerned with people than ideas. According to Kolb's learning skills profile, assimilators are associated with quantitative, theory, information analysis, and information gathering skills. The diverging learner occupies the upper right quadrant of Kolb's framework, between the reflective and concrete axes. Diverging learners are people-oriented and tend to rely on watching and feeling, or intuition. This type of learner solves problems by taking risks and is best at generating alternative ideas and imaginative solutions. Kolb's learning skills profile associates diverging learners with information gathering, sense-making, help, and relationship skills. These brief descriptions of Kolb's 4 learning styles demonstrate both similar and diverse tendencies among the learning styles. Styles that adjoin each other on Kolb's framework may benefit from similar teaching styles. Those in diagonally opposing quadrants require different, yet supporting approaches. Therefore, teachers and trainers should identify and understand their students' learning styles in order to design programs that address the learning process as a whole. For instance, trainers should take the learning styles inventory themselves in order to have an understanding of how their respective learning styles affect their personal teaching styles. The Learning Styles Inventory provides a framework to examine one's own approach to learning situations and, depending on the learning material and situation, one's own strengths and weaknesses. By being aware of these factors, trainers are better prepared to apply them to create effective training programs. For instance, trainers should vary their teaching techniques in order to address the different learning styles. Trainers should also consider using learning modalities that acclimate participants to learning styles other than the one each prefers. Becoming accustomed to using other learning styles reduces learning barriers created by inflexibility of personal learning styles. There are times when trainers have to compensate for a restrictive training topic or facilities they cannot rearrange. In such cases, incorporating strategies, resources, or other aids will help learners to work in another learning style without first gaining the skills needed for that style. The best strategy for these situations is to find alternatives to overcome the weaknesses. Trainers who will be working with the same group of participants over an extended period of time may include new learning style skills in their overall programs. To do so, the trainer develops training strategies that will assist the learner in developing greater strength of skill in another learning style. Providing even a minimal level of competence in an additional learning style helps the person learn more effectively and may reduce potential need for compensation in future sessions. Last but not least, trainers should remember that Kolb's learning style inventory is based on his experiential learning model. Use of this model reiterates and reinforces the material being taught and encourages focus on each of the 4 learning styles. The experiential learning model also provides opportunities to use a variety of teaching strategies, helping to maintain participant interest and involvement. In summary, Kolb's learning style inventory describes 4 learning styles: accommodating, assimilating, converging, and diverging. These learning styles indicate dominant learning tendencies, which are not fixed traits but a manner in which the mind operates. Additionally, most people do not exclusively learn using a single style. In order to effectively address the different learning styles of training program participants, trainers must be aware of their own learning styles and the effect of their individual learning styles on their respective teaching methods. By using this knowledge, trainers are better able to address the training needs of their students. Strategies trainers may use to design effective training programs include varying teaching techniques, compensating for not addressing a learning style or styles when necessary, and introducing skills needed for non-preferred learning styles. Last but not least, use of Kolb's experiential learning model will help trainers incorporate teaching techniques that are designed to maintain participant interest and involvement.
Hello, my name is Monty Cox, and this is the Learning Styles Inventory presentation. This presentation is based upon the work of David A. Kolb and his work in regards to learning style inventory and experiential learning. According to Kolb, there are 4 different types of learning styles: diverging, assimilating, converging, and accommodating. Each one of these styles is made up of at least two subcomponents: either concrete experimentation, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, or active experimentation. And before I begin to talk about the 4 different learning styles in a bit more depth, I'd like to go into these little subcomponents: the concrete experimentation, the reflective observation, the abstract conceptualization, and the active experimentation. Now, to make it easy, I'm going to choose a subject with which we are all familiar with, which is cooking, and specifically the making of chocolate chip cookies. In the concrete experimentation level, we really are at the very, very beginning of learning how to do something. We're beginners. We're not very knowledgeable. We're going to be prone to making mistakes, and we're going to need to learn from experienced people, and we might have to do a little bit of research in classes and books or online. As you begin to actually work through the process, and in this case the cookies that we're making, and you begin to do this for the first time, you're going to have some reflective observation time where you're going to sit back and think, well, what was the end result? What were the reactions of others? What was my reaction? Was their reaction critical? Was it supportive? Is the process more clear to me? Is the concept more clear to me? And is there a desire to continue to attempt this thing again and to keep on going? This is the time where you're going to sit down and reflect about your first time trying this. After you have gone through this, through a couple of cycles of the learning and the reflecting, you're going to begin to work through what's called the abstract conceptualization, which is to, now that you have a pretty good understanding of what the base components are and what the process is, you're going to be able to work through and come up with some ideas on how you can change things here or there. What did you like about the end result? What did you not like? What are some of the things that you can alter to change the outcome? What things could be changed? And what things could be either added or deleted, or what other kinds of combinations of things will work. And in this particular case, instead of just using the regular old milk chocolate chip cookies, we're going to throw in a little bit of dark chocolate chip cookie, or dark chocolate chips. We're going to throw in a little bit of raspberry flavoring, and we're going to throw in some red food coloring to boot. And we're going to see what that ends up doing with the cookie. And as we go through that particular process, now we're going to go and do the actual doing of putting all of that imagination to work, but we're going to be doing it in a bit of a different way and seeing if we can come up with something totally new. And in this particular case, you look at the cookies over there on the right hand side, and we have raspberry and dark chocolate chip cookies. So this is the active experimentation part, where we have really begun to build on what we have already learned through the active experimentation, through the reflective observations, and we begin to really see that there's an immense amount of possibilities to what it is that we could be doing. There's almost no limit as to what it is that you can come up with or continue to try, and learning just kind of compounds on itself. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the 4 learning styles. The first learning style is the diverging learning style. An individual that is really dominant with the diverging is going to have a strong concrete experimentation and reflective observation skills. This type of person is going to love to work in groups. In the case of making cookies, you could often see them either making it with their children or in big groups, or doing some kind of a cooking thing in big groups. They're people-oriented, feeling-oriented, group-oriented, and they really do care about the diverse cultures that are out there. The next one, kind of a loner on this one, I have to admit, the assimilating. This type of person is a combination of abstract conceptualization and reflective observation. They really tend to perform their own research, form their own thoughts, and they tend to work by themselves, and they prefer reason and logic over working in groups. This type of a person who's making chocolate chip cookies is really going to be doing it by themselves, but only after they have had an opportunity to really sit down and read through a process and become an expert on it in that regard. The next one is the converging. This type of person is a combination of abstract conceptualization and active experimentation. These people are ideal problem solvers. They enjoy the decision-making process and making decisions. They usually prefer to work on technical problems, and they also tend to work alone. So this particular person is going to really take a look at not only the end result, but ask what went well, what didn't go well, how much flour do I need to add, how much water should I have added, or no water at all, or how much, or this, that, and the other. They're really looking at the end product right there and seeing how they can actually improve it. So they're really doing quite a bit of an experimentation on this one. The accommodating is also an interesting type. They're based upon concrete experimentation and active experimentation, and they are good at really good at trial and error problem solving. They're comfortable around people, and they actually use a lot of their intuition to solve problems. They kind of build upon what others have done. You can find them really kind of gravitating towards the experts in the field that they are interested in, and they're going to listen to those folks, and they're going to take that information and go back home and experiment with it almost immediately, as though they were the ones that have already learned everything that they've needed to learn. They kind of work, if you will, a little bit, I don't want to say backwards, but using that intuition, they're building upon other people's work that has already been done, and then deciding to how to go forward and what kind of experimentations to use in the future. Now, in the work environment, how are the 4 learning teams or 4 learning styles, how are they working together? How should teams in a work environment be constructed? And as I was sitting down thinking about how teams would come together, you would think that maybe you should put some similar people together in performing a task. And in this particular example, I used in the building or construction trades. And if you bring together mechanical, electrical, structural, chemical, civil, industrial, and metallurgical or environmental engineering, and you bring those people together, stick them in a room and tell them that you wanted to build a building, they're going to build one. And it's going to work, and it's going to be functional. And as a manager of that particular group, you would think that you would be ecstatic at the end result that they are putting out there, and you think you've got all your bases covered. And on the surface, it does look like that is the case. But if you just throw in a little bit of diversity in there, such as having your architectural engineer in there, all of a sudden it just takes on a whole new scope of things, and you're able to create something through adding that diversity in there. Even if you're just missing one person or one team of diversity, you're definitely missing out on what you could be building. So the question is, what's actually better? Is it better to have a team of similar people, or is it best to have the diversity? And it really is best to have the diversity. Having those diverse teams is the key to achieving those spectacular results. Everybody coming in, everybody really contributing to that, and having those the diverse ways of solving problems, the diverse ideas, the concrete, the abstract, to bring them all in together. Very, very critical to have all of those people coming in there. And thank you very much for watching.